Hi, welcome everyone. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to get settled, get your audio going. We've still got a lot of people coming in, so it's always like this at the beginning of one of our programs. So I just want to get as many people in to hear the beginning as possible. Let's see. Thank you all for coming. I was just saying this is a bit of an unusual time for us, but I am just, beyond thrilled to be able to introduce this program. Still letting people in, however. I'm going to have a very lively crew today. So my name is Kathy Sigmund. For those of you who are new to civic engagement beyond voting, we're a group that follows state level politics. That means we cover the Arizona state legislature on down to a lot of the positions that you may see a lot lower on your ballot. Our rules of the road are, please feel free to post in the chat. I love to hear from people who are first timers to our events. We have regular happy hours during the legislative session online. We have a ton of people who come. We have a very, very lively group. So it's always exciting to get new people. And also, please, as those who come to our meetings know, put where you're from, because it's just great to see people from all over the state. So we will try to curate some questions to ask at the end. We have a very substantive conversation to have. And I will leave it up to Anand to decide whether he wants to address anything he sees in the chat. But otherwise, we'll try to have time to throw in some questions at the end. Please be courteous in the chat. Please don't argue or dominate the chat, but we very much welcome your engagement. So it is incredibly exciting to me to introduce and welcome Anand Giridharadas, who is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Persuaders, which I have right here. If you haven't read it, I really urge you to. I had to run all over the house to find my dust jacket because I had been dragging it around the country with me in dog-earing pages and so on. So Anand is an author of the best-selling The Persuaders and a number of other international bestsellers. He's a former foreign correspondent and columnist for the New York Times. He has also written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Time Magazine, a variety of other publications. He is an on-air analyst with MSNBC, and I have seen him on a whole bunch of other channels. He's the publisher of the newsletter, The Ink, which I really urge you to subscribe to as well. And he lives in Brooklyn, New York, with his wife, Priya Parker, and their two children. So I want to start with a quotation that you wrote, Anand, from The Ink on January 15th, 2021. This is not the chaos, and I should note this was just a few days after the January 6th insurrection. This is not the chaos of the beginning of something. This is the chaos of the end of something. We are living through a revolt against the future. The future will prevail. And I absolutely love that, because I love that you approach your work with hope, with optimism. That is so important to those of us who work in the trenches of grassroots organizing. So I'd like to start by just asking you to give some background on how you came to this work.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to do this and bringing together. I love all the different groups, not just towns, but groups represented in the chat. So I love this. One of the many things the Persuaders is about a kind of coalitional spirit and coalitional ethics. So the idea of so many groups coming together to talk is an example of that, and I'm really grateful. I mean, just to start with that quote, I think, and I'm happy to get into, how I got into the work, but to start at the kind of end, I think the last many years, I mean, looking at the groups represented here, from Indivisible to Save Our Schools to, um, every single one of these groups, this cannot have been a fun period in our nation's history for all of you, for any of us, right? If you care, if you want more equality, not less, if you want this country to have dignity for more people, not less, if you want education and the teaching of history to be more honest and not less, if you want, more democracy and not less, this is has been a punishing era. And I think because of that punishing quality of the era, we sometimes lose sight of the fact of why all of this is happening, right? And we sometimes take this incredibly dangerous set of movements that you all are working against, and we make them even bigger than they are, which is not to say they're trivial, but that we sometimes center them. We sometimes make them the protagonists of the drama of the American story right now. And based on my work, reporting, interviews, writing, I have a completely different view of who that movement is and how it fits into the story now. And maybe it's worth starting at the end and then we can work back. But in a nutshell, I think what we do when we fall into this kind of funk, this despair, and center them, is that we tell a story that there's this kind of darkly exciting, galvanizing new American fascist movement on the march that folks are kind of valiantly and maybe futilely trying to resist. And I actually think the story is the opposite. I think the story is a story of a country that was founded in terrific ideals so good that its own founders were not brave enough to live up to, a country that has consistently, persistently tried to get better, has gotten better, has made life better, brought more people in to its idea of we over decades and centuries. And in the last few decades, in the lifetimes of the people on this call, has changed arguably more for more people than all the previous time, in terms of truly living up to the notion of everybody being able to vote, everybody having a voice, everyone being able to work and work without impediment, and so on and so forth. And that actually, in the quite late stages of this progress, with so much of this progress actually under our belt, progress that you all are working for every day, there has been a movement of backlash. Okay? It's not frontlash, it's backlash. It's called backlash for a reason, right? They are not the protagonists of the story. They are reacting to progress. And this is, at some level, very, unsettling. But at another level, if you just think about it, totally normal, right? Totally normal. It's like when you go to the doctor and you have like a big thing on your body, like that's not evidence of a problem necessarily, right? It could be totally normal or it could be a big problem. If the doctor's like, yeah, that's gonna happen given that river you swam in, or that's gonna happen given that thing you ate, calms you down. Well, I would say if you are doing the amount of social change, progress, expansion of the we that we have been doing in the last few decades, you're gonna get some people, a minority of people, it's actually a remarkably small minority in some ways, given how much we have changed, who get uncomfortable, who are slower to embrace these changes, who feel unsettled by them, who experience them as headwinds more than tailwinds, right? You can't do the level of equalization of the status of women as we have done in this, say, 5-6 decade period, and not have a significant number of men be like, whoa, that feels weird to me. Unfortunately, a lot of men don't confine it to just saying that, which would be the honest statement of what's going on with them. And then they go into bad movements. You can't do the level of racial progress or demographic change or immigration that we do in this country without having some people who are going to feel unsettled with the future, right? And so what has happened, in my view, is a tremendous amount of real progress in the arena of bringing people into that bigger idea of the we, has created a backlash movement that is emotive, powerful, very cunning. They know they're dealing with a minority, so they have to actually kind of trick a broader number of people in. And I think we have to remember as a starting place that all of this is happening as the dark side of a good thing, as the dark side of progress. We have won and are winning and will continue to win. And that this small-hearted faction has always been there in American life. They have been on the wrong side of every single fight, from slavery to child workers in factories, to whether you have, fire escapes on buildings, to whether you have a social security and old age insurance, whether you have gay rights. I mean, on every single fight, there's been a bigger we team and a small-hearted faction. And it's often toe-to-toe in the moment. And in the long run, the small-hearted faction has routinely been crushed. And so I want to start there by saying I'm not writing from a place of hope out of a kind of Pollyanna-ish sense. I just think it's worth remembering why we are in these battles, and we're in them because of, to quote Donald Trump, too much winning.
Thank you. I love starting on that note because it was definitely one of the reasons I was so eager to have you speak to us. So the very premise of persuasion is that people are persuadable. So at a time of very entrenched partisanship, what does this mean and how does it happen?
Can I say that last part again? It cut out for a second.
What does it mean to persuade people? How does it happen?
So the Persuaders book is a loving intervention. There are different books that I've written have kind of tried to do different things. And an earlier book I wrote called Winners Take All was a not especially loving intervention with the kind of billionaire class and people who, were grabbing more wealth and power while kind of cosplaying as philanthropic saviors. This book is different. The Persuaders is a loving intervention with my own allies, with what I would broadly characterize as the pro-democracy movement in this country, arguing that we have succumbed to a culture of smallness and of writing people off and of thinking that we can't pull more and greater numbers of people into our movements. And we've kind of, in this era of polarization and the rising populist nationalism and all of that, we've succumbed to a kind of fatalism about each other. And this fatalism, I think, is the true gift to the kind of American fascist movement that we face. And so while it is comforting sometimes to write people off, while it's tempting, while it's kind of emotionally satisfying to say, you voted for that, you'll never come around. It's political stupidity. And too many of us, myself included at many moments, have succumbed to it. And so the Persuaders is, although I'm kind of framing it this way, it's not an argumentative book. It's a book about people doing the kinds of work you all do, activists, organizers, educators, others, who have refused the great write-off that many of us have succumbed to. This is a book about a kind of handful of dissidents to the great American write-off, people who truly believe that not only can our movements persuade that they must, and people who are really thinking very practically about how. So just at a high level, there's a chapter, this is, by the way, almost entirely a book about women and a book about largely women of color, who I think, in my view, and I don't frame it that way in the introduction of the book or anything like that, but I think it's notable that there is a kind of insurgency waged by some of these women I'm writing about against an older Democratic Party kind of white, affluent, elite theory of persuasion, which was largely persuasion by dilution. If you think about the Democratic Party of the 90s, and frankly, not that long ago, you persuaded by watering things down. You persuaded by half a loaf. You persuaded by, not talking about abortion, right? You persuaded by, doing everything you could to win those white working class voters and not offending their sensibilities, and, not doing too much healthcare, not doing too much student debt relief. And I think these women that I'm writing about are waging, as I said, a very successful insurgency within the party, some of which is reflected in the kind of Joe Biden presidency we've gotten that's quite different from the Obama and Clinton presidencies, even though I don't think he personally is, particularly more progressive than either of the others. That these women are pushing for a theory of persuasion that says, A, we have to reach out beyond the choir and we have to win, beyond. However, the way we do that is not by diluting and cutting our beliefs in half, right? Amputation of conviction is not the road to persuasion in their analysis. Rather, you have to kind of jazz up your hardest core people by giving them something to feel excited about. And at the same time, kind of ambidextrously, you have to be able to speak to a much broader audience about those values, about those policies, in a way that doesn't marginalize them, right? And so there's a chapter in the book about messaging, there's a chapter about organizing strategy, there's different ways of looking at it. But I am interested at the broadest level in something I think probably everyone on this call has been thinking about in these years, which is, how do you stay true to yourself and have convictions and also reach out? Because it is super easy to reach out if you have no convictions, right? It's super easy to be friends with Strom Thurmond if you have no bottom line, if you have no red line, I should say. It's also really easy to have strong convictions if you're not interested in outreach, right? It's really easy to just lay out very stark positions and just stand there, and those people don't necessarily change countries. What I'm interested in this book is people who are showing us a way to stay true to yourself and reach out, to stand for something and reach out. And I think that is the future of persuasion that a lot of our movements need.
Yeah, there, as you were talking, there were so many different ways that I felt I could go with a follow-up, but what it brings me to is Anat Shenker-Osorio, who many of us have followed actually for a number of years. And it speaks to the passion that you need to be able to deliver in order to get people to follow and to persuade. And she is such an amazing proponent of how to do this, how to, energize your base, to persuade the middle, and then basically marginalize the opposition. And it's a model that I'm a huge fan of. So can you talk a little bit about her work?
So when you think about, Anat's work is so interesting. In some ways, she's the philosopher queen of this shift that I'm talking about. And so a lot of the people I'm writing about use her work, or she advises them. It's kind of an interconnected group of people that I'm writing about. And she really is the kind of language and message expert in this cohort. And I think, and by the way, I think if you look at the squad, if you look at elements of the Black Lives Matter movement, if you look at the way Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Joe Biden talked about race in 2020 versus some of them earlier, you see her kind of fingerprints on a lot of modern messaging. At the heart of it, there's so many valuable things I learned from her, but I think at the heart of it was actually something that I learned from multiple characters, and she maybe theorizes a little bit more than people just doing the work on the ground, but they were all, including my final chapter in Arizona, this was at the core of this also, is the notion, it really spin my head around, which is that our mental model of moderates or swing voters or whatever, is that they are in the middle, right? And often those words they use interchangeably, like moderate, centrist, middle of the road. And I would submit that if I asked you guys to like draw a visualization of a moderate, like I would bet 90% of people here would draw some kind of spectrum and then like circle the middle part of the spec. Like in our mind, moderate and middle. I mean, those words are actually not related, but I think in just our mental model, it's like the center, centrists. And what her research has shown, and others have found in the field, is that moderates are actually not people hovering in the middle point of our politics. They are people whose convictions are a little bit all over the place. Okay. And this is different. Okay. In other words, if you are, I'm going to give a very simple example. If you are from a strong military family, multi-generational military family, and you go to church and you don't know a single gay person, if a gay rights referendum comes up, you're not probably going to be a conflicted voter, right? Like everything in your kind of convictions and experience may align. Okay. Now let's change the example. So you're a strong military family, but you have a gay child. Okay. And you belong to a church that is currently having one of the many churches that is having a schism over gay rights. Okay, so that referendum comes up now. What are you going to do? Are you going to go with a certain political conviction you have? Are you going to go with one of the church positions? Are you going to go with what's good for your child? Right? I think you all know people, right? That person in Anat's framework is a moderate. Okay? Does that mean they're near the center? No. They may be the most hawkish person on the military, 99%. They may be on the gay rights issue because of their child, super progressive, just on gay rights, right? Their church, they may be like part of this schism. The idea that that person is standing in the middle and that we therefore need to come to them is preposterous. That person is confused, torn. That person is pulled different ways. There are people and institutions in that person's life that mean something to them, that give them esteem, that tell them really different things. If they go with the gay rights side of the argument, their kid will love them more, and people in their church who they value may love them less. If they go with the other position, they may have more esteem in this church community they go to every week. Their kid never comes around anyway. But they worry about that relationship suffering, right? When I read New York Times articles, but frankly, when I hear us just in movements, I don't hear a nuanced understanding that this is who we're talking to. Not all the time. There are people out there in clan robes, and there are people out there whose entire lives are trying to send women back into the Handmaid's Tale. And there are people out there who literally just want all trans kids eradicated. They exist, and they're not a trivial number of people. But they are not most of the electorate. They are not even most of the electorate that's not with us at many moments. There are a far greater number of people who are kind of all over the place, torn because they are committed to multiple different views of the world. And unlike probably almost everybody on this Zoom, they don't actually have a perfectly formed algorithm and philosophy and worldview for figuring out new things. And I'll just give you one little analogy to that you may relate to. If I were to say, raise abortion or any other political issue to anybody on the Zoom, I would guess everybody quickly knows what they think, right? You all have an algorithm for that. I would venture, maybe I'm wrong, that when ChatGPT and AI kind of came into the scene over the last few months in the conversation, I would bet that most people on the Zoom did not have as fully baked an algorithm and worldview to decide how you think about that, right? Because it's just something like most of us don't know enough about, right? We don't have years and years of reading and experiences and discussions. It's kind of like a new thing, and suddenly we have to think about it. Well, the confusion that many of us feel around AI, we're still forming a way of feeling about it, is how a lot of undecided voters, or even just gettable voters, feel about these issues. And I'm dwelling on this because I don't think anybody I know working in politics actually like deeply feels this and thinks this. And once you look at the world this way, the whole political project changes, right? You need to then think about, how do you harness these inner conflicts that people are having in your direction? And what you cannot do is say you are monolithically this because you go to that church or voted for that guy. You have to recognize like that people are much more tormented internally, and that torment is your opportunity. And you have to then think about what are ways of making more salient the part of people that is for progress, for equality. And there's a lot of things we do that make it harder for us to do that rather than easier, right? That make those people feel like, you know what, it's just easier to be intolerant all the way down, right? So when we, by the way, such a powerful example of this is the incredible work a lot of, women-led groups did, Kansas and elsewhere, around abortion after Dobbs, right? Where they protected the right, the right to abortion, not the political right, by kind of shrewdly tapping into a certain amount of libertarian right-wing sentiment of like, keep the government out of my life, right? And there were these women in Kansas who ran these ads obliquely comparing abortion to mask mandates. Now, by the way, the women who ran the ads, they all supported mask mandates, right? But what's politics without a little cynicism? They ran these ads saying, back in the mask mandate time, Kansas didn't like the government telling us what to do with our bodies, and we don't like it anymore now either. Well, that's brilliant, right? And that is not, whereas a kind of my body, my choice is speaking within an existing moral circle that you've already conquered.
Hmm.
Everybody who likes the phrase my body, my choice is already in your movement, okay? But keep the government off my body, that's the kind of maneuver that's really interesting, because you still hold all the people who are with you, but they pulled in some of these Republicans who were not fanatics, hadn't frankly thought about this issue a lot. And when you framed it slightly differently as why should the government be messing with our bodies, right? And you kind of relaxed it a little bit, you were able to broaden it in these ways that brought them incredible, resounding victories. And I think if you look on issue after issue, there's potential to do this, but we're often not doing it. And we often make our own issues sound more marginal than they ought to, right? When we're talking about the battles in education for trans kids and trans kids getting the healthcare they need, et cetera, there's a way of talking about these things that makes them sound very particular and niche and applying to a small number of our fellow citizens. And that's fine. These are technical issues. But there's other ways of talking about the same thing that really captures like the sweep of these issues, right? I would talk about the trans kid issue in terms of like bravery and freedom, right? You like your soldiers brave? Who is braver than a 13-year-old trans kid, right? Find me a braver individual than a 13-year-old trans kid. I would put probably a 13-year-old trans kid from a small town in Oklahoma on any kind of bravery index with any member of the U.S. Armed Forces, right? So why is the discussion about trans kids with DeSantis not about bravery? Why is it not about freedom? Why do we allow these things to sometimes get talked about in ways that make our movements feel and seem small? When in fact, what I think we're talking about is the freedom to be who you are, the freedom to read what you want to read, the freedom to know the truth about the past, the freedom to, not have Ron DeSantis be your gynecologist, and so on and so forth. And so I think we have to make our movements as big as they deserve to be, and feel and sound as big as they deserve to be.
Yeah, I'm going to have to clear that out of my brain at some point.
Sorry, that was, yeah.
Yeah. um, this really, it strikes me that what you're also talking about, and one of the anecdotes I pulled out of the book was your profile of Linda Sarsour, whose mother was working for, supporting a gay Latino candidate running for city council, and she was a Palestinian immigrant, and how they were able to find common ground in a shared experience of being discriminated against. And the way this speaks to me is in terms of the complexity of some of the portraits that you drew of people. And, to sort of jump to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that really, really struck me hard in your chapter about her and the complexity of the line that she has to walk between starting out as an activist and then becoming an insider. So can you speak a little bit to that? I have another question about AOC, but something she said in the book, but I wonder if you could start with that.
Yeah, I love that point. I mean, it's funny. This is really a book. You hit the nail on the head. It's a book about, I think all my books have been books about people grappling with hard things, right? Which I think is the best way to just learn about things. And so just as a form of literary presentation, I think I often am drawn to watching and portraying people who don't believe one thing, but who are in some form of kind of struggle with themselves. And then watching them struggle with those things is illuminating, hopefully, to us. So just quickly, each of those two women, Linda Sarsour, Linda is, for those of you who know her by reputation, I think if you to take the 2-second bio, people would view her as one of the most strident, militant, these kind of words would be used. I mean, she's regularly accused of being an extremist, this and that, but also in other ways quite a mainstream figure. I mean, it's just depending on how you look at it, was one of the co-leaders of the Women's March, etc. One of the things that's less well known about her, that someone kind of pointed me to, is that in a lot of these progressive spaces she's in, activist spaces she's often actually the one in the room, out of public view. She's often the one in the room talking about, we got to appeal more broadly. We got to appeal more broadly, right? So while she has this kind of perception of being the wild-eyed activist, she's also, it's not kind of either or, but she's also really, really the one who's saying, hey, are we, like, how do we sound outside the communities that we, so I was very interested in that, right? Because that was not the reputation I knew of her. I knew her personally a little bit, but that surprised me. So I dug into it with her. And it's one of my favorite moments in the book. She says, she says, look, I understand a lot of the voters who are right now voting with the other side and voting for very dangerous things, because, and I understand this kind of, older folks who are voting these movements, older white folks, white men, etc., who just are kind of resistant to a future that they fear. And she said, I get it, even though I'm not like them at all. I'm a brown Muslim woman. I get it because I grew up in a really conservative Muslim community. And I, was taught to believe really terrible things about gay people. I didn't know a lot about other communities. I mean, she says I had very little experience of Black communities, even though I grew up in Brooklyn. Her father had a store, so she knew some Black kids, but almost everybody else in her kind of Arab American community in her neighborhood was like really separated from Black communities that lived right next to them. And she said, I had to go on a journey. Right? I came into these movements and learned about the LGBTQ community. I started doing organizing with Black churches and had built connections and relationships that I didn't get from a childhood in Brooklyn, New York. And she said, so that, you know, that 50-year-old white guy in Michigan who's uneasy about change, I can see the rhyme. You know, he in the kind of current social graph of American life, he's a privileged white male and she's a brown Muslim woman. And what I love is Linda's like, it's a little more complicated than that. We're both people who were raised a certain way, and now the future is asking us to think a different way. And like, if we don't give people a beat to change themselves and be changed, and actually have a program to change people, not just kind of tap our watch and be mad that they haven't yet arrived at the place of enlightenment we demand of them, we don't have a movement. And organizing, as she puts it, is sort of this kind of slow work of helping people on their journeys. And I think this is really important. And it's, I mean, some of you may, you know, hear this and totally agree. And some of you may think like this is kind of soft pedaling some really, you know, bad sentiments out there in the electorate. But I sometimes think on our side, going back to the beginning, I think we like undercount how much we have changed in this society. And the fact that like, it's a lot for people. It doesn't mean that the changes are not good, right? But if you think about, just to take one issue, think about the status of women in terms of family and work over the past 60 years, right? Like more change than in the previous 1,000 years, right? That's just a massive, massive rewiring, reweaving of everything. It has changed literally everything. Now, I, like many of you, favor this change. I'm very happy it happened. I want more of it. It's not done yet, right? But I think you can just pause and before you judge it, say, this is a change that has changed everything. It's a change that has changed how we educate kids. It's a change that has changed how you can behave in a workplace. It's just like, it's a lot. Just because elements of our progress are good doesn't mean they go down easy on people, right? By the way, these changes are hard on women. Just because they're good for women doesn't mean they're not hard on women. You know, every woman I know today has more complexity around juggling work and this and that and having, you know, it's more empowering to have 8 selves, but you know, it's also a lot of work to have 8 selves and be a kingpin at work and, you know, a perfect mom, like, right? I think we sometimes don't understand, like, we are living through, and I've just picked one issue, but if you think about the rise of China and the decline of manufacturing, you think about racial progress in this country, you think about immigration and demographic change, on and on, the internet, right? We have changed kind of everything for everyone in a very brief period of time. And there's like some allergies out there, and we're freaking out about very predictable allergies instead of saying, hey, I totally get why you as a man feel emasculated right now, or feel like you can't control your family's destiny, or feel like you're not being respected. I get it, right? But here's what's really going on, right? Here's why we're really doing this, right? And when we don't actually address that kind of psychic substrate of what's going on, we leave the terrain wide open for the DeSantis's and whatever, right? I long for President Biden to talk older white people and older white men through this era, not just push policies, like talk them through it. At certain moments, for small instances, he's done it, but like people are feeling this. People are feeling social change of this kind always makes some people feel like losers. It always makes some people feel mocked by the future. This is normal. You're not a bad person to feel like, you know, equality creates confusing conditions if you had it good before. And I just think our movements in the spirit of Linda Sarsour need to be talking people through what they are feeling, because they're feeling it anyway. And then explaining to them why actually a world where women are equal is more fun. right? We're actually a world where every kid, including your kid, can be the fullest version of themselves is actually more fun. But that it's okay to feel scared. It is okay to be scared that your kid's going to school and being taught things about gender that you can't really keep up with because you don't know a lot about that. That's okay. It's not okay to vote to exterminate people because of that. But is it okay to feel fear about what you don't know and things that you never heard about 5 years ago that are now seemingly everywhere? Yeah, that's okay. And I think we need to have merciful, loving, conquering movements that say we can take anybody from anywhere who's fearing anything and meet them where they are and pull them in.
Mhm. Now, what I want to do is sort of jump to another side of that, because this is actually one of the things that I find most interesting personally. So, and this is the other AOC question. So she said, if people are talking about your agenda, even if they're talking about how bad and silly it is, you are making that agenda more plausible. So you've also talked about, and I think it was in an interview that you gave, not being afraid to pick a fight. And this seems to be a little antithetical to what you've been talking about. So how is that a tool of persuasion?
Well, I think it's really important. I've thought about this a lot because in some ways that after Persuaders came out, there was some of these articles in the press about, his last book was like picking a fight, and his next book is like telling people to,
Get along.
try to reach out, and like, has he changed? Like, did he and I don't think I have. I think there is a place for each of these modes. And I would summarize it this way, and I think a lot of us confuse this. There's in a very summarized form, I think we need to be better at picking fights, pick more fights with the powerful. And we need, frankly, a little more creative demonization of the very powerful who abuse their power. And I think we need more persuasion of our fellow citizens, right? And I think what we sometimes do is treat Rupert Murdoch, right, and our Uncle Rupert as the same, right? They're not the same. Uncle Rupert is a victim of Rupert Murdoch. He may also be voting for terrible things, and he's not only a victim. But if we believe that the people who own Fox News and the people who Koch brothers and others who are, multi-billion-dollar empires they're building to dupe and deceive people, which is what I think we believe, it's a little bit hypocritical to be mad at people who are victims of what we believe is a con, a well-funded, incredibly powerful con. I mean, the reason we're mad at the con is because we think it is so powerful that it's hard to resist, right? Fox News is good enough at what it does. I think very intelligent people could watch Fox News and be broken, right? I don't think Fox News only works on stupid people. I think Fox News works on anybody who exposes themselves enough to it. That's what is so dangerous. If you believe that, then we have to be able to say, you resist Rupert Murdoch, you demonize, you condemn, you pick fights with Rupert Murdoch. But if you are in the kind of same posture with every voter who has succumbed to Murdoch's channels or ideas, well, then you're just going to lose, right? And so I think this kind of pick and fight thing is, I am a big believer. I think part of what has made progressives more effective in the last decade compared to the past is a real willingness to pick fights with insurance companies and with corporatist Democrats and with, establishment donors, picking fights with their own people. I'm a big, I think infighting can be great. I think infighting can be very, very clarifying. I don't think infighting is necessarily bad. There's a place for fighting. But I think sometimes we risk demonizing voters. You don't resist your fellow citizens. You resist the powerful. You resist big institutions. I think we sometimes got tricked into like resisting our neighbors. You want to win your neighbors. You don't want to resist your neighbors. And second, I would say, kind of as a more general point, there's a way in which fight picking can make your side, make your movements just kind of like unattractive, you know? And I think this is a problem for a lot of our spaces, that we believe the right things, we say the right things, but we are not, by people on the far right, but just like not particularly engaged people, our movements come off as kind of like tedious and hair splitting and angry. And, you know, I mean, I remember, you know, there's different versions of it. There's a kind of identitarian version, there's an economic, like Bernie, for example, right? I know so many people who couldn't vote for Bernie, and it had nothing to do with substance. They did not know his policies in detail. The vibe they got from his movement was like angry, hostile, judgmental. And it was partly him, and it was partly online behavior of some of his support, right? I don't think they were entirely wrong. Like, I think there was a certain closedness in aspects of that movement, right? And I have a chapter on Bernie in which Faz Shakir, his second time campaign manager in 2020, talks about that problem of smallness that he inherited and how he tried to change it and how hard it was, right? That was a movement where lots of people in the movement actually didn't really want newcomers in some deep sense, right? I remember seeing interactions online where people would say like, Bernie seems like a great guy, you know, I mean, I'm a big capitalist, love capitalism, but Bernie seems interesting. I'm going to be checking out what he has to say, right? And you'd see these like leftist supporters online being like, you're a capitalist? How could you be a capitalist, you idiot? And it's like, what are you doing? That was like a customer walking into your restaurant being like, I don't know what I want to eat, but I'm hungry and I have money. And you're just like, you don't know what you want to eat? Get the hell out of here, right? It's just like, what are we doing here? And I think there's versions of that on an identity side. You know, people talk about gender in this like kind of awkward way. And you're just like, you're not using the terms correctly. Like, we don't want the people who want to exterminate trans people in our movements, but everybody who's confused about pronouns, I want every single one of them in our movement, right? And there's a big difference between being confused about pronouns and wanting to exterminate trans kids. And sometimes I think we don't make those distinctions in a very intelligent way. And it's very, very dangerous because, you know, that old Hunter Thompson book, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, like there's a difference between fear and loathing, right? And when I look at people who are not voting for our movements right now, it is a coalition of fear and loathing towards the future we want. But fear and loathing are really different. There are some people who kind of fear the future that those of us on this Zoom want, and there's other people who loathe that future. And when we conflate fear with loathing, I think we become kind of ineffective at the strategy we need, which is to peel off the fear people, a lot of them, and leave the loathing people in their loathing.
That's great. Now, I have so many more questions, but what I did promise people that we would talk about Arizona specifically, and there is a chapter about lucha and deep canvassing in Flagstaff in the book, and it's one of the reasons why I hope people will buy it, and I've seen a lot of that in the chat. But Arizona, and I'm sure every state thinks, well, our state is the weirdest, and I certainly feel that way about Arizona. I mean, it could be perceived from the outside as oh, we're turning purple and look at all of our senators and top of our governor. But when you go below the surface, Arizona, it has a lot more conflict. And those of us who do legislative work have been just drenched in a legislature that has election deniers and insurrectionists in leadership in our legislature, fake electors, etc. So I think Arizona is a little more libertarian than traditionally conservative. But what I'm curious about is your perception of the political landscape in Arizona and what you perceive. You're on the outside looking in, but I would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the chapter that is in set in Arizona is perhaps my favorite of the book. And it's about deep canvassing, which is something I'm sure many of you have exposure to. And I it was actually, this book was like started right at the beginning of COVID, and then, the reporting finished in the post-vaccination world. So for some of the middle parts of the book, the AOC, the activist chapter we talked about, I couldn't really go out into the world, which is very frustrating to me. And so it was all like interviews. And then finally, the Lucha chapter is like, is like when I finally got to go somewhere again and do what I actually do, which is like sights and smells and like seeing things and not just like talking to people on the phone. So the chapter is a little bit of life to it, a little bit of Arizona life to it. And what was really powerful about it to me was this philosophy. It was kind of the Anand philosophy of like voters are complicated brought to life. And it was, this guy I followed, Cesar. I mean, he's an undocumented guy leading this team of people doing canvassing on immigration. And I don't know, like, I feel like every, US citizen I know, and, white college educated elite person I know is more mad at anti-immigration voters than Cesar was. Like Cesar just thought that they didn't know him yet. Like what a wonderful, powerful, I mean, you can call that naive or not, but like that guy has more time in the trenches than most of us. And he just viewed, like, he was just so clear that exposure to his humanity and the humanity of people like him, would win a significant number of people over. And he, in a way, dignified both himself and the people on the other side of these conversations by saying, if you have hate towards people like me, it's got to be out of the fact that you don't know what you're talking about. And I think he'd be the first to say no one has to go do that. No undocumented person has to go knock on the doors of people, who might be hostile to them. But a certain number of people will want to do that. And a certain number of women are doing this on abortion. A certain number of gay folks are doing this on gay rights. A certain number of trans folks and others are doing this on trans rights. And the biggest thing I took away is that these people on the ground who know what they're talking about, they see us actually not as a country divided between us, but a country of people divided within themselves, right? And it's a mind-blowingly different way to look at this moment. And they are finding ways to speak to people, to play one value someone might hold against another value they hold in a way that is moving people. Deep canvassing has more effective, data-driven results than almost anything else we do. It's just very slow. It's not efficient. And I saw, Carrie Hull, we should be deep canvassing now. I mean, I think if there's like one breakthrough idea, I mean, I don't know how many deep canvassers we have trained, maybe a few thousand or something like that. Like, I think we should have like 3 million people trained for deep canvassing, right? If I was in charge of the Democratic Party, I would build a 3 million person deep canvassing army for 2024, right? So that is something that I think is hopeful, but it's rooted in this notion that people are persuadable, and they're persuadable because they are complicated. People are complicated. You are not the only one who is complicated, right? You are not the only one who has complicated thoughts swishing around in your head and feels one way and then feels the other way. Everyone's actually like that. And I think that insight, more than any other, may be the way out of this era of polarization.
Mhm. So, yeah, and I know Carrie Hull personally, and I can assure you she is one of the best canvassers in the state. So, we are coming to the end of our hour, and I again appreciate so deeply that you have given us this time. What would you like to leave us with?
First of all, I'm going to share something in the chat. I So thank you for all of you joining this thing. I'm going to do a special free trial of my newsletter for anybody who wants to join. So you can check it out. And a lot of what we're going to be doing between now and the 2024 election is actually looking at some of these deeper undercurrents of the question of democracy and persuasion, and questions of how our movements can really not just win this or that policy battle, but win the larger battle for the era and for hearts and minds, as the subtitle of the book says. And I'm just really, I would, if I have to leave you with any thought, I would say, I think we have to ditch the funk. I think we have to ditch the despair, right? I think we have to remind ourselves and then the country that, first of all, and this is a really important thing to say that we don't say enough, this is a great country. Doesn't mean it's not a flawed country, but it's a great country. Let's say that a couple times, because I don't think kind of fascistic movements on the right should be the only people waving the flag and talking about the country. And then let's talk about the fact that since the beginning of the country, there has been this contest to have a bigger we or not. And slowly, fitfully, painfully, violently, that fight for a bigger we has prevailed again and again. And there has been more dignity and more justice and more equality and more participation and more voice for more people. And that we are now in a dark place because some people are throwing a giant world historical hissy fit over a future of equality and justice for all. And we have to do a better job of simultaneously patting them on the head and crushing them with overwhelming political force, but not turning them into some giant monster that kind of embodies the future. This is a kind of, they are, I like to say, and people repeat, they are barnacles on the hull of our progress. They are not the ship, right? We are the ship. And I think we have to remember that and fight on.
Oh, I love ending on that note. Now, Anand, if I could ask you for 1 minute, we have somebody who will take there was no way to get a shot of both of us looking great. So for our post-event publicity, can we just have one just nice look? Okay, I think we're good. Thank you so much. I appreciate this more than I can say, and I definitely urge people to get again. I saw several people saying they were going to rush right out and buy it. So oops, there we go. And also subscribe to the Ink, and thank you for that complimentary deal. So tons of appreciation in the chat, and I can't thank you enough. So goodbye, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna click out, everyone. For those who are still on, if you want to save the chat, there was a ton of information. There should be 3 little dots at the bottom, and you can just click Save Chat. So thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.